Thanks, Paul. I'll start. Associate Professor Jane Burns. Jane is the Chief Executive of the Young and Well Cooperative Research Centre, which explores young people's use of technology and its impact on their mental health and well-being. Jane has a PhD in medicine from the University of Adelaide. Mm-hmm. She has been a finalist in the Telstra Business Women's Awards and also has been listed in the Fin Review and the Westpac 100 women list of 100 women of influence. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you so much for such a beautiful introduction. It was like a little test. Now, Sue, I think I met you probably 18 months ago when you first came to Suicide Prevention Australia as the CEO. Yes, was it 18 months ago? And Sue's worked in the not-for-profit industry for many, many years. She wouldn't tell me how long, but I think it's probably 5, but you know, you look wonderful, Sue. Predominantly in cancer and breast cancer. So you were CEO of the Breast Cancer Foundation of Australia. And Sue, and I know this from the many meetings we attend together, is similarly as passionate about people's well-being as I think I am and as Dawn is. And we continue to champion the benefits of collaboration, cooperation, and I think the collective impact model. So it's a great privilege to be on a panel with 2 of my favourite people.
Thank you.
Well, 3. Sorry, Paul, I don't know you yet. You'll be one by the end, I'm sure.
By the way, I did contact a few other people working in this sector to see who else could join us. I did invite Georgie Harmon, who's the new CEO of Beyond Blue and came from the National Mental Health Commission, I believe. But she's actually just flown off to the UK yesterday, so we missed her by a day, sadly. That would have been 4 women CEOs on the panel. But I'd like to just open it up to questions, and really anybody who wants to ask any questions about collective impact, about what's going on in mental health, what's going on in suicide prevention, or the transferable applications of this approach, and how the RSA fellows might be able to help make a difference in those areas where it maybe needs anything else that you can contribute, basically. So please do feel free to fire away. Once we dry up with questions, we'll have some nibbles and drinks and we can all mingle and chat individually, but this is your chance to ask questions to the panel.
Hi, my name is Erica Myers-Davis. I'm General Manager down at Crown Mission, and we work with people with mental health. I really found it quite interesting what you said about the trolls actually in the competitive funding. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Victoria we've just gone through a major recommissioning of the mental health sector, and essentially we've gone from about 50 service providers down to 15 for the whole of Victoria, and some very large players are now out of the space, such as Mind and Mental Illness Fellowship. Now at the mission we've sort of done okay, we're still around and still providing mental health and support to people. I guess they saw some of those the mind maps that you were showing, and they've looked to streamline and make the system simpler. So on the one hand, that's worked. On the other hand, it's meant that there's some quite significantly large and small community groups are now out of the sector, which we're quite worried about. And in particular, whilst we've gained funding in some areas, we've actually lost funding in our regions to the tune of a few $1 million. And in fact, drop-in centres are now no longer funded. So that means that people who really aren't in the system in the first place, who don't have Medicare cards, who don't do GP appointments, who are transient, who are homeless, now have nowhere to go. And I guess it's probably not so much a comment, but more of a comment around this whole aspect of competitive funding. It doesn't create collaborations amongst agencies. In fact, what it's done is created a lot of secrecy. I call it the golden handcuffs, where we've been wanting to tell the public about what's been happening for the last 12 months, we haven't been allowed to. So you're only just now hearing what's been happening over the last 12 months, but we've known that drop-in centres in particular and group work and peer support work was what the government called out of scope. So we were unable to even apply for the money. Now, in the area that we're in, sort of Prahran, St Kilda, City of Stonnington, City of Port Phillip, South East Melbourne, where we have 2 drop-in centres, we were receiving about $1.1 million in funding. That has gone. completely. So we'll now have to rely on philanthropy to keep those open. One of our centres was open 365 days of the year because years ago we found that suicide rates went up at Christmas. We now are no longer funded to provide those services, and the people that we support, probably around 300 to 400 people, don't have a voice, they don't vote, they're not on the census. We know that homelessness, people who are experiencing homelessness, about half of them will have serious mental health issues. And again, I know when I go out now to look for funding for this from philanthropists, they're going to say, well, why didn't you tell us this a year ago? But because of these constraints by government, we've been unable to talk about it. Per annum, St Kilda now has the highest rate of usage of ice in the world. So we're also impacted by those drugs, and yet we've been unable to talk about it. And I don't know what we can do in terms of, obviously now I'm talking to local MPs and all sorts of things about what's going on. However, to me, this was all preventable if we were able to collaborate and work and actually talk to the community, because the community has no idea what's about to be unleashed on the 1st of August, and that there will now be more people on the street. And when you then consider that the state government is spending more money on prison beds, so we've gone from saying that we're going to build 500 prison beds to 1,000, and those prison beds are $100,000 each a year to support a prisoner. With 5 prisoners, we could actually keep, or even 10 prisoners, we could keep drop-in centres open.
Yep.
So I guess I'm sort of quite interested in the idea of the trolls. But that's just my comment.
Well, Dawn, do you want to go first, and then Sue and Jane
Sure.
can add?
Thanks, Erica. Absolutely. I think, again, this has been an example of trying to impose a simple structure to solve a complex problem. And I know governments love a simple solution. I love a simple solution. We all want to just simplify things. But in actual fact, the result may not be that we need less numbers of services, but that we might need more, but we're measuring the impact of those and the effectiveness of those in a more transparent way. And again, part of the kind of crazy situation that we've ended up in is this, the gag clauses where, and because it's such a competitive environment, service providers are not providing data to each other because we don't want to disclose that maybe our great program that we thought was going to really take off, we actually only had 3 people turn up, or the other one where it's data that suicide rates are going up, for example, and no one wanted to talk about that because the government had invested more in the funding, and we don't want to talk about things not working. All those crazy things. So I think we really we need some clever minds to really think long term about what do we want our societies to look like, what's going on right now, and and constantly monitoring at a population level, how do we effectively respond to that as a community. But it's no simple solution, and I think a simple restructure of funding is not going to fix the problem. That's my conclusion. Sue, do you want to?
I think probably here's a good reason to be thinking about how can we adopt this framework. I think one of the issues for suicide prevention is that we get put into this box called mental health, and that can work for administrative purposes, but in fact really it enables people to abrogate responsibility. Oh, that's mental health, I'm employment, so that doesn't impact me, or oh, that's mental health, that belongs over there with someone else. And I think it's also stifles innovation, the fact that we think only of mental health. I think it was great. The design awards were not about the aesthetic beauty of something, but in fact how they can deliver a social return with their particular design elements. So I think I'm very, very concerned to hear what has happened. I think it is really a huge challenge that it will leave the communities with. But if I put on my rose-coloured glasses, which everyone will tell you I'm extremely good at wearing, I would say, look for the opportunity that this presents. Look for the opportunity to step outside the box and perhaps see how there can be better coming together of people with a like-minded cause or concern behind them.
Okay, I'm going to start with a story which is going to make me sound extremely naive and silly, but I think it's worth talking about, particularly given your focus on the community and the consumer. I set up the Young and Well CRC back in 2010. It's funded by the Department of Innovation, so it's not health, it's not education, it's not social, it's not family. And I had about 6 months to do it, and I literally went to all of the people that I knew in the mental health and youth sector. And I had no criteria for inclusion other than that they must have been committed to young people's mental health, that they must look at innovative models around technology, and that they must have a commitment to working with young people, and that young people were going to drive the research agenda, that it wasn't going to be driven by the scientists, it wasn't going to be driven by the service providers. And so in that 6-month period, I got 63 organisations signed up. I had the big kahunas, the Beyond Blues, the Headspaces, the Lifeline, the Kids Helplines, etc., etc. I had 19 universities, and I also purposefully had as many small NGOs, SMEs, as I possibly could, because that's where the innovation was. I also had industry partners in Facebook, Google, Telstra, Yahoo. Now, we've been going for 3 years, and I think to talk about trolls, there are plenty in the space. So regardless of the fact that they've all signed up to a collective impact model, it is still not without major challenge, and it's still not without people one-upmanship and grappling for and driving to get more money in. So the way in which we've worked is to put young people at the centre to say, this is actually what young people want. So it takes away that competitive argument of, well, I'm a university, I want this money to do my little research project over here, or I'm a service provider, so I want money over here. It's driven by the needs of young people. Now that is still not without challenge, and I take your point, Dawn, and having worked together for many, many years, the system is fundamentally broken, and we know that. It is a top-down medical model that literally does put the power in the hands of the provider. So what we're driving to do and asking and trying to bring people on the journey is how do you actually put the young person at the systems level so that they're the empowered consumer, and they then start to vote with their feet, which is where the technologies become so critically important. Because you get rid of the services, not get rid of them, but you recreate and disrupt that old service system model and say, actually, this is what's going to work over here. So we're still in that naive learning phase where you think, oh, everyone's on the journey, and then someone suddenly turns around and says, actually, I'm not on the journey and I want to take you over. And you're kind of going, oh, I didn't expect that to come out. It was a bit left of centre. But I think it's that constant and that honest reflection on what works, what doesn't, and who is in the tent and who's not in the tent, and working out who to get rid of, because the trolls are there, they continue to be there. I think we are breeding a new breed of leaders in our young people, and I certainly look at the young people coming through, and they are not in any way, shape or form the competitive old school, we're there to get the bucks. So, but it's a long process.
Sure, and just a very quick one from me. I can see more hands going up, which is good. When we set up the big ideas for Suicide Prevention Forum, and we had our business people and we had our very diverse group of people initially in that, with nobody from the mental health sector or suicide prevention sector, as it were, we were all collaborating quite happily. When I opened it up to the sector, somebody said to me, I'll join as long as they don't join. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but this is a place for people who want to collaborate. Gary had his hand up first, I think.
Yeah, I did pre-warn you that I was probably going to be a heretic here. And listening to your first part of it, where you were talking about Dave Snowden and so on, I'm definitely going to be a heretic. Dave and I have had words in the past. I'll give you a perspective from having done behavioural change in large organisations, across large groups. My suggestion to you is that nothing will change and you will continue to have no effect until you recognise that there are feedback loops within suicide, or whatever you're actually talking about, but suicide particularly, that continue to create the situation. And unless you can change or disrupt those loops, it will still fall back into that same structure. And that's where Dave and I disagree in terms of complex adaptive systems and so on. He has a different methodology. My suggestion is that what you need to be able to do is first understand those loops, understand those behavioural drivers, what's actually going on, which can be very difficult to get a grip on. But when you've got that grip, you can find out the part of those feedback loops where you can make the smallest possible change to break that loop. If you can do that, you can have a large-scale effect because the loop stops working. If you don't understand that, you're forever doing what is effectively what the healthcare industry does. The healthcare industry is not about healthcare. It's about disease management and disease care. It's much more interested in the disease than it is about the patient. And in fact, it doesn't actually want the disease to go away, because if it did, it wouldn't have a job. And I think the same thing may be happening here, that there's a lot of focus on the organisations and who's doing what and where they're doing it, and not on making themselves totally redundant by understanding and fixing those feedback loops and where you can actually make a difference. And you're talking about long time frames, large groups of people, and particularly talking about metrics. You should be thinking about how can we do this really quickly with a minimum amount of money and a minimum amount of change, because generally speaking, the minimum change is about the only thing you're ever going to be able to do.
Mm. That's great. Yeah, I think let's pick out of that, Gary, a couple of challenges there. One is the feedback loops, the feedback mechanisms, the learning loops in there. The other is this issue of, on the one hand, we're often told these things take a long time, but what possibilities are there to speed up the process? What are there sort of anything that people have done, any case studies where being able to speed the process up? Or does it really have to be a longer time route?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think feedback loops are absolutely critical, and understanding those. So I'm very interested in meeting people and talking to people who understand how to do that systems mapping and identifying what the feedback loops are. And I know there's lots of clever people out there that do that, and mapping that in the social space. And one of the examples I might give is a good one. It's called 90 Homes for 90 Lives in Woolloomooloo in Sydney, so King's Cross area. Been rough sleepers for a long time in that area. It was again during the Rudd period. They had some money to fix homelessness, and so they brought together some builders and developers, a bank, some social sector people, United Way, some philanthropists, etc., and they all sat around the table to fix homelessness in Woolloomooloo. And one of the great things that happened is that they asked some questions, some curious questions. So first of all, they said, well, how many service providers are there? So they did a mapping exercise, and there were 52 service providers in that region, servicing the homelessness population, which included the police and emergency departments, and so it was the whole spectrum. And then they said, well, how many homeless people are there? And no one knew the answer to that. So, don't know. So we know how many times they come into my service, but that doesn't make any sense if you put all that together. So the business people, thankfully, wouldn't let it go and said, well, until we know what the problem is, how many there are, we're not progressing. So what they did was they asked their staff to volunteer. You can do that when you pay them. Asked them to volunteer to go out in the streets at night between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning to count how many homeless people there are. And they discovered there were 90, because they just counted them. Radical idea. And now they've housed 87 of those 90. And they've got supported accommodation. The services have got wraparound care for those 90. So I think, it's that thing of, if we really think creatively around what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and don't just quickly come up with a solution. I think that's one of the things that we too quickly try and find a solution and then apply it. So in the past, someone would have come up with a great project or program. Whereas they did the discovery, they took the time out to do the discovery. And I think that's part of the trick, and that's where those feedback loops come in. What is the part of the system we're going to try and change first off, and how are we going to do that? And then you go on from there. We could talk for a long time about that.
Yeah. Sue, do you have a comment?
I'm extremely challenged by the time element of this. I'm a sort of person who decides we're going to do something and then we do it. And so 18 months ago, I actually was a convert to collective impact because of my experience in the sector, before I came into this role, and I was very excited by the opportunity. And not only that, I was presented with a sector who had already made the decision that they wanted to adopt the collective impact framework. So I thought, you beauty, I'm here to go, and everybody wants to do it, and so we'll have this up and running in 6 months. 18 months later, I am finding it extremely challenging as to how you do move things forward, and how you engage individuals who have professed a willingness to want to do something different. If you look at suicide numbers, they've really followed pretty much a plateau for the last 20 years in both males and females. And there's been dips and troughs, when you look at particular age groups, but generally the numbers have hung around the 2,000 to 2,500 for the last 20 years. So, credit to people who were in the sector long before me, who recognised the need to do something differently. But it is time is a much greater challenge, and I think speaking to the people in the UK, trust is the thing that they have felt has really taken a huge amount of time and energy, and I'm guessing it's those feedback loops you're talking about that interrupt the trust building.
Jen?
The only thing I'd add is I have been in the suicide prevention sector for 20 years. In fact, I started when the Burdekin report came out, which was on the rights of people with mental illness. And so I have seen this constant banging of your head and this constant sense of how do we work better together, and these constant conversations about collaboration and cooperation. And I think probably I had my light bulb moment when I started the Young and Well CRC, which was you look at tech companies and the way in which they do things, and they rapid prototype, they throw away what doesn't work and they go on and try something else. And so it's that loop to find a solution. And I think what we'll find, and Sue and I work with the same organisations, is that we will leave those organisations behind. They probably will no longer exist as we continue to, and it's easier in tech, as you loop around solutions, and we're starting to do it. And so we go back to rebid next year. There's a question in my mind as to who are the partners that go forward in the Young and Well CRC. It is about young people's well-being. Do we need the mental health service orgs? And that is a really challenging question, because if you don't need your mental health service orgs, then who are your partners in this? Is it the Facebook, the Google, the small to medium enterprises? Are it organisations, do you include organisations that have a focus on young people's entrepreneurship? Do you completely get rid of an old antiquated medical model system and the services that perpetuate that and do something completely different? Because if that's where you're trying to change the system, then maybe that's the change that you need, and they become a system of the past.
I'll just add a couple of things, and we've got great to have more questions again. In direct response to those points, I think the feedback loops absolutely are critical, and I think they have to be learning loops, not just feedback loops. And one of the problems I've had starting to get heavily involved in the mental health sector is that I can't use one of my best lines that I've used for 25 years in business, which is the definition of insanity. Which is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So trying to get those feedback loops going and learning loops going is really important. The other thing, in answer to the question about can you speed the process up, I do this in my life. I sort of help organisations speed that process of change up. And it's a simple method that works every single time. It's never ever failed me yet. And that is that getting all of the key people together and doing a joint visioning exercise. Everybody's a map, so we get people to do a projection exercise, we get people to be in the future and to map out that future so specifically that everybody can see it in the room. You can even turn it into a questionnaire and start measuring how far away you are from it. And it takes people that journey. They always start the session by saying this is going to take us 3 to 5 years. They always finish the session saying we can do this in 18 months. And so it's trying to get people to see the future. And when I first got involved in the mental health workforce issues over the last couple of years, I just kept asking the question, so what does it look like when you've got there? And it's taken a long time to answer that question. And somebody actually said to me, Well, we haven't answered that question yet, Paul. We haven't really kind of discussed what a mentally healthy workplace looks like. And I said, why not? They said, oh, we've been busy having meetings. So I think there's some insights there. I'll go to Tim next.
Just a brief one. Tim Watson-Munro, I'm a forensic psychologist. The last 3 or 4 years I've had an exponential growth in young offenders who are addicted to us. Notwithstanding that, I was astounded to hear that Paran and Fitzroy has the largest percentage of ice use in the world. It's just extraordinary. But I was wondering if the panel had any ideas about a collaborative approach to what is becoming an increasing social scourge that really is going to rob this country of a generation if it's not dealt with. That's it.
That's all.
Shall we take that as a comment?
Well, I think.
No, I'm
I
interested
think,
in some feedback.
Sorry, Tim.
I mean, I think it's like all of these things. I think we need to get all the right people in the room and start to really grapple with it, because I just there doesn't seem to be any simple solution at this point in time. And there are many people like you saying that.
It's across all strata of society too.
And in the country areas, I was just in the Macedon Ranges the other day. They were talking about the rates out there. It's terrible. It's really terrible.
Were you surprised by the statistic that Erica gave
I
us?
didn't know that Paran was the highest in the world.
And St Kilda wasn't.
Paran and St Kilda. Sorry.
Shall we take another question from Oliver? And
I guess my question is, how would you get the buy-in of the wider community? Because my experience is, as soon as you talk about complexity to the general population, they just turn off. They just want the simple answer, black and white, what are you going to do, who's in charge? How do you get the wider population to get into this complexity thinking?
I mean, I think the work around creating a common agenda that's very compelling is something that really does, people do coalesce around. So those campaigns you were talking about where there's a compelling statistic like the one we've just heard this morning, I think that's when the community generally engages. And often that will also engage when there's a crisis of, when something's happened which demonstrates there's this problem in our community and it's impacting on us now. So, I don't think everyone wants to sit around and grapple with the complexity of the service system and all that sort of thing, but I certainly think everyday, ordinary people in community will engage if it's something that's close to them and that's compelling enough and communicated well enough.
I've got a very simple one. We're going to halve suicide over the next decade. That really has resonated well. Now, they don't particularly, the community generally is not particularly concerned about that. They're inspired by that. And it's utilising that sense of inspiration while all the complexity is being dealt with by the organisations and the government and our business people. But for the community, it's that very simple aspirational statement. And we may never get there, but by golly, we're going to try damn hard. And community responds to that aspiration. It's something they want to hear.
My only other comment on that, and I also wanted to comment on something you've raised, is we always make the point of we have strong, hard, solid data, but here is young person's story. This is what it actually means for me, the individual. So while the complexity might be this very big picture thing, for the individual young person, that is the single most powerful story. And I mean, you talk about the community, we're dealing with politicians all the time. So politicians are looking at cycles of 3 to 5 years. They don't want big complex problems to solve that they're going to have a solution in 20 years' time. They want it now. I think to your question around the ice epidemic, and certainly a lot of the conversations that we've been having have been with organisations like Turning Point and WIDAS and others, where there's major question around service reform and what it looks like and how they're going to start to work together. There is a bigger challenge there, which is the academic debate, which does no one any favours, because you see these great debates happening of it's anecdotal that the ice epidemic's on the rise, and then you've got academics who are saying, well, the figures don't support it. And the same thing happens in our mental health space. Plays out on the front page of the paper, people don't agree, academics don't agree, and I think we need to get better as a sector in providing a united common voice, and we are not anywhere close to being united as a sector. Whether it's in depression, anxiety, drugs, alcohol, eating disorder, it doesn't matter.
I would say 80% of the people I'm seeing these days have an ice problem.
80%.
And 30 years ago, the typical 17-year-old was a car thief. Today, the typical 17-year-old that I see is using half a gram of ice per day. He's suffering, or she is suffering major depression, which then impacts on the suicide prevention issue. They commit crimes to support their addiction, which then impacts upon the growing number of beds that are required in prisons. And there seems to be no intelligent cost analysis of dealing with a core problem, which would offset a lot of other problems.
I just want to ask Sue if she can help me out on something. I was thinking about mates in construction. I think you know a fair bit about. Before that, just commenting on something that Sue said there. We're finding all the people who are getting involved in the big ideas for suicide prevention discussions, and all the people who got involved in the conversations around the world. We had RSA fellows in the States and Canada and Denmark and Japan and lots of people getting involved. And I asked them why they got involved, why they were particularly interested in this topic. And a common response was that a lot of the debates we have are about problems that, not that problems can't be solved, but they are long time frames and they're difficult to imagine solutions. And people keep asking me to get involved in debates around sustainability and climate change and all this kind of stuff. But with suicide prevention, they all immediately latched onto it and said, well, I can see how I could actually make a difference in my lifetime. And I can actually go and do something now. So it really was a sense of, it was a hopeful kind of message, really. Mates in Construction, we did actually try to get the CEO of Mates in Construction here today, and I couldn't make it, unfortunately. But it sounded to me as two things. First of all, that statistic that kind of gets people going. I remember having that conversation with Jorgen, and also then what's happened. I don't really know what's happened since, but I think the statistic was something like people in the construction industry are 6 times more likely to die from suicide than accidents at work. It was something like that. Yeah, and it just again, it immediately got everybody's attention. I thought, what? That's crazy. So I think it's great to get that statistic. But what's happened in the construction industry? Because it seems to have been a success story.
Yes.
Or not?
Well, no, I think it's only been going in a structured way for the last few years. But the Mates in Construction trains individuals within work sites to identify people who are in vulnerable situations, and then provides a pathway for those individuals to be supported. And they've trained, I think Jorgen said something like 44,000 construction workers over the last 5 or so years. So there are a number of people now, and then they have levels of training. You probably know more about this than me.
That's right, you're doing well. But the great thing is they do it like around a barbecue on the work site. It's very low key, and it's all done bloke to bloke.
Yeah, it's on site.
It's not.
It's a bloke thing. It's not
It's a bloke
an it's not an organisation going in and training. No. And I think that's the point. It's peer-to-peer education between blokes and blokes, so that they're looking out for each other, which is part of the construction industry's mateship thing. Now, I think the challenge in implementation is that it is exactly that. So it hasn't been picked up by government, it hasn't been broadly disseminated, because it is driven by the not-for-profit
And the union.
and the union. But in that respect, it's a great model. So why it hasn't been taken from Queensland and implemented across states and territories, I think
is now.
Yeah,
it is now.
Well, I rang round all the mining companies, the top 20 mining companies recently, and a lot of them said they were looking at Mates in Construction as a model.
As a model, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, which makes a lot of sense. I went to a conference that they ran earlier this year, and there were 200 people in the room, but they were HR managers, they were site foremen, they were people who were working directly with the workforce. And it was terrific to see. And I think that same sort of thing could be replicated across a number of industries, particularly where we know that there are higher levels of suicide occurring. But I think it goes back to one of the comments that Dawn made about the importance of place-based activity. I know when I came into this approach of collective impact, and I had this cohort of national organisations who were all ready to go, and I thought, bloody hell, we're going to change Australia here, yahoo! But I've really come to the realisation that I think it will be a hybrid thing where we as national organisations work at more of a systems change level, and the implementation of suicide prevention will come down to very much being community driven, community supported, community coordinated, and ultimately I would hope that that might even drill right down into families, because I think that whole notion of families and cohesiveness and support that families provide has really, in my lifetime, dissipated enormously. And I wonder, I have no reason, but I wonder if the sort of experiences that you're having, Tim, comes back to going back to the Strive one. You walk right back down to early childhood, and what do we offer in early childhood, and how do we build our education system? I started my life in the teaching world, and I was allowed to teach, and I had a fabulous time. I just loved it. It was fantastic. But my friends who are still within the system, they don't teach anymore. They're welfare. They're authoritarians. They're asked to be everything else but educators. And schools have been looked to with a captive audience to be the arbiter of all society's ills. Fix it up. We'll get into the schools. That's not entirely the answer.
Chris?
I think
Sorry.
the drug thing too, early intervention, early education.
But what about values?
Yeah, and
What about internal values for an individual that tells you this is not a product I want to participate in? Sure,
that gets to peer group
experimentation.
influence, and that's a very difficult
But
thing.
values can overcome that too.
Chris?
Challenging.
I
Next.
said difficult, not impossible.
No,
What's,
I agree.
One of the things that I get bemused about is whether it's a single issue or a range of issues. There's a complete morass of people operating in that sector, to the extent that even if whether you're a corporation or individual and want to contribute something to it, there's a queue a mile long outside your door. Who's got the answer?
Yeah.
If that was in the commercial space, then rationalisation would take place in the market.
Yeah.
People would die out, other people come out, people would be taken over. You'd get, the successful would win out. What's the mechanism of how that works in your sector, and how can we accelerate that? Because there must be so much duplication.
It's
such
why
a
everyone's
dreadful
terrified of collective impact, because it's about measurement
And data.
and data.
Because it's the data the population level data, and actually being transparent with each other about how we're progressing towards achieving
There has been
an
no
outcome.
scorecard.
No scorecard.
What's happened is government have funded organisations as they've started up. Some have been great, some have been not so good, but there is no accountability. No one measures.
Did you achieve an outcome?
There's no outcome measurement at all. So the sector is
activities.
terrified. It's how many people used your website? How many people came into your service? There's no measurement of, did what you do really make a difference to this young person?
So what's the prognosis? I mean, how long is that? What's the prognosis? Are you going to continue surviving with this sort of morass of providers, or
Well,
is it going to be just two of you up on stage?
It's going to be the survival of the fittest.
I mean, I would hope eventually that there would be enough momentum to shift the way funding is allocated towards outcomes and population measured outcomes, so that we actually, and that we all, if we're going to get the funding, we're required to measure against outcomes, not against activity. At the moment, it's all activity.
I think the other thing to add to that, and I think we're still not on parity with health. So the mental health sector still is not on parity with health. So the amount of dollars that are spent on health funding, we don't reach in the mental health sector. What we're saying is not that there needs to be less dollar, but rather that we need to be much more united in our common approach, and that if you're an organisation that does promotion, you stick to that and you coordinate with those who do service provision so that you get best bang for your buck.
One of the elements that Dawn mentioned as part of collective impact is mutually reinforcing activities. And one of the things I'd like to think is that as we move forward in the design of this approach, that organisations who are doing activity A over here and activity A over here suddenly realise that we're doing activity A and we're funding both. Is there an opportunity for us to merge our activity A's and actually combine our resources? Or do I change my activity A to activity B, which is a different part of the puzzle? You know, I intellectually and theoretically, I can see that could come out of the collective impact framework as it's moved into implementation. And in the commercial world, you might think that there is an opportunity for mergers and acquisitions. And I would think that there is potential for that, you know, not in a takeover sense, but in a sense of realising that I have skills and experiences within my organisation that can actually address a different part of the puzzle, so I actually don't need to be doing the same part as someone else is.
Because it seems to me that unless the sector fixes it, the only way it gets fixed is that people who give the money actually, whether they're completely on the wrong assumptions, will make, you know, pepper the pig dies.
Yes.
That's what happens.
Yep.
You know, they'll actually make those decisions.
Yeah.
And there'll be casualties on.
And one of the great challenges, and I saw this in cancer many times over, is it's a bee to the honeypot syndrome. So when there was a $2.2 billion injection of funding into mental health, then you have exactly that. People who are working in some other field suddenly move from bowel cancer, now I'm a breast cancer researcher because this protein I was looking at in bowel cancer, oh, actually it's active in breast cancer, so let's move over there. And I think there's risk that 2.2 billion has attracted people into the sector that may otherwise have not come into it. And I do have another solution, which I'm not prepared to share yet.
Oh, we'll hold that one back in anticipation. Just a quick response from me as well, Chris, is I remember being involved in placemaking initiatives in the UK, and we did 28 different towns and cities, reinventing towns and cities, especially in industrial areas where steelworks went and coal mines went. And we used to get everybody together, and there was a lot of fear there. But we used to go through a stage which we used to call collective conflict, where we'd get everybody to recognise that they had to actually be in conflict to come up with a better solution, to be able to come up with a vision where potentially they could all bake a bigger pie together. Now, there's an advantage there that there was a big pot of money from the European Renewal Fund, you know, so that there was a lot of money floating around there. But everybody would get together and put their own organisational baggage outside the door when they came into the visioning session, because they knew they had to change what they were doing to get a solution that was better for them as well as better for the whole collective. So I think we can learn transferable lessons from some of those kinds of experiences, but obviously funding is always an issue. We've got sort of 5 minutes left, I think, in terms of, is it just, are they going to throw us out the room, Mark, or shall we keep going? Erica's got a hand up, and again, I can see other hands up there as well. So
Just two little points. One point just about the question at the front around the, you know, to me the economic rationalists have won. And in terms of government funding, we are 110% accountable. Our funding is outcome-based, so we can't just take money to provide mental health services and show what we're doing. We actually only get paid when we have an outcome, and that's certainly what's just happened in Victoria, where, you know, as I said, we've seen a whole bunch of service providers now rationalised down to about 15 or 18.
How many originally?
I think something like about 45 or 50 originally. So there's certainly no duplication of work. We now get paid once we can show an outcome that people have met goals. And certainly with the federal money we receive for our employment services program, which is supporting people with mental illness into employment, we only get paid when they've been in employment for 13 weeks. It might take us 18 months to get them into employment. We don't get paid for that period, only once they're in employment. So it certainly is outcome-based and very much commercially focused. But the point I wanted to come back to was your point actually about the negative, the feedback loops. And certainly one way that we look at mental health at the mission is, in actual fact, we we sometimes sort of see it as actually not a health problem, and that really disrupting the thinking and thinking about it as a social issue. And certainly when you look back to Australia, you know, in early sort of colonial times, mental health was seen as a social issue, you know, and it was seen as something which the community had to get involved with. Once Australia took on board British Mental Health Acts, that's when everything became much more medicalised, and therefore you had specific organisations working to, you know, sort of use a medical model to support people. But we certainly see mental health as a social issue, and it's something like about the people we work with, for example, in our Hearing Voices groups, about 60 to 70% of them who'd be diagnosed as having schizophrenia tell us that they've experienced childhood trauma and abuse. So we know that there's certainly a link between something that's happened in childhood that's now, you know, causing them to experience hearing sounds and voices. So, and we know that having a peer support group mechanism works incredibly well. For some reason, as I said, it's out of scope when we look at government funding. We cannot get funding for peer support work. And when you look across, you know, you look across all organisations, and, you know, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous, Mother's Support when mums have got new babies, we know peer support is one of the most incredible tools that we have, and yet we don't fund it. And I'm not sure why government won't fund peer support. But really, the answers are all within ourselves. If someone has been through that experience, they're much more likely to help someone else going through the same experience. But for, you know, I guess because it's not a medical traditional model, we don't fund that. But again, you know, we look at these things as having social impacts. We look at whole of community. You know, we work probably collaboratively, but we probably don't really call it that. You know, we'll be on the local council estates, you know, having sausage sizzles, talking to some of the single mums about, you know, maybe getting some training, help with whatever it is that they need. And we know at a local level this really works, but unfortunately it's very hard to get funding to pay for those things to happen at a smaller level.
Sure. Thanks, Erica. I think we're going to have to close it off now, but everybody can be around a little bit. I know Sue's got to get off and get a flight, but and thanks for coming down from Sydney. Is it down or across? I don't know, but it's from Sydney anyway. We're going to be, all the board members and the fellows are going to be hanging around for a while, and if anybody's got any other questions. I keep coming back to that statistic that, or that fact that Erica gave us, and that's a great rallying sort of call, I would think, to get people involved in solving that problem. So I think I know of a few other people who might want to rise to that challenge. And I'd like to finish on a note with statistics. And Sue's left us hanging now with something she's not telling us. So I'm gonna not tell you something. So right, so you didn't hear this from me. No, you did actually hear from me, but there's some research that I've been involved in which has been released this week as part of the Heads Up campaign. And I said to my colleague, you know, you get those moments, like really important. You don't get many of them in your life, but you get those moments that are really important. You know, when people say, I can remember where I was when Kennedy was shot, and I can remember where I was when the Twin Towers fell. Well, I can remember where I was when I saw the results of this research. Because I've been working in this field for 27 years since I set up the Human Resources Research Unit in 1987. I was in an issue building in Canberra, and it was 2:50 p.m. on Wednesday the 21st of May. So there you are. Watch out for that research.
You're not going to tell us what it is.
I'd be dead if I told you. I've been told I would be carved up and put in a box somewhere and thrown in a deep river with concrete attached to me. Thank you very much for coming. We've had a great turnout. We've had a great chance to sum up where we are. We've got tremendous energy in the room and fellows wanting to get more active, which is fantastic. We've got live projects which seem to be energising people. It sounds like we've got a few more brewing up from what we've heard today. It was fantastic to have Dawn's talk and to get us thinking about collective impact and how that might relate to the kinds of things we're doing and can do in the future. And it's been great to have this panel and to get a few, a bit more food for thought and different perspectives. It's not a sector that we've kind of heavily got involved in the past, but we've always been dipping in and out of this sector, and I think it sounds like we're very much in there for the foreseeable future. But the great thing about the fellowship is its breadth. It's a broad church. It's got people from so many different walks of life, and we operate on the basis that it only takes a couple of 2 or 3 fellows to get passionate about something. It's the Shared Passions Network, And it's very much that Margaret Mead principle, you know, that it's a small group of people that change the world. We don't lobby government, it takes too long. We just try and change things, and then government usually follows. So that's our philosophy. So thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you.